Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. What's new with FOR518, Mac and iOS Forensic Analysis and Incident Response? My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is Sarah Edwards, SANS instructor. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Sarah.
Thank you, Carol. Hi, everyone. I hope everybody's having a great afternoon and or evening and or wherever you are. I know it's an afternoon in the DC area. Just had a good, fun commute to get back home to start presenting this. So this is just hopefully a relatively short, it's not going to be a huge hour-long thing, but a relatively short presentation just to give you the gist of what is brand new with Forensics 518, the new Mac class. I say the new Mac class because that's how much it changed. It's been a ridiculous update for me, ridiculous in a good way. There's just so much to tell you about. So a little bit about what we're going to cover today. You might have noticed that there is a new course title, there's new labs, there's brand new data, there's new images, there's cheat sheets, there's challenges, there's coins, and a little word about the Net Wars challenge that we're having in Austin in a couple of weeks. So just a few things to go over. And again, if you do have questions, I'm going to be trying to watch the questions window. If I see it pop up, I will try to answer it best I can, but if not, I will answer some questions at the end of the presentation as well. So please do stick around and wait for those questions to be answered. So first off, the title. So it used to be called Mac Forensic Analysis. I've been kind of adding more and more stuff into this as this course has been updated over the last 4 years. So it was introduced as a beta in April 2014. So it's been a good solid 4 years now. During that, I used to have only one iOS day. And forensically speaking, Mac and iOS have changed so much during that time that it used to be redundant. So now we talk about Mac, we talk about iOS throughout the whole course. From day 1 all the way through day 6. You're going to get both devices because many of the artifacts, I'd almost guess to say that even 90% of the artifacts are the same or extremely similar across all these devices. And when I'm saying Mac and iOS, I'm talking the Mac OS platform as well as the mobile platform. That's including everything from iPhone devices to iPads. Might even talk a little bit about Apple TV and Apple Watch stuff. So pretty much almost everything that has an Apple logo on it will be discussed in this particular course. Now, the second part of the new title, the incident response part. So I've always had a good chunk of incident response and security related data in there. I have a good amount of students who come in from not a forensic background, but more of a security operations type of background. So there's a lot of things that I point out in there that would be helpful from a security aspect as well. So even if you just do your basic forensic analysis, looking at Safari history, your email, the user-based artifacts, you might be thinking, oh, incident response, I don't need that. You'd be surprised how much of that is overlapped with the security aspects. You're looking at the same artifacts, you're just coming at it from a different angle. So please don't let that turn you off. There's still plenty of artifacts in there that you can use from both sides, from either a true standard forensic analysis, the traditional forensic analysis, used in courts and criminal proceedings and things like that, but also the incident response part. So what do you do when you have a system, either whether you're acquiring it, whether you want a RAM dump, whether you're looking from an intrusion aspect to see if it's been compromised, malware related artifacts, how the security of the system, how that affects the traditional forensic analysis that you might be used to. So that's kind of why I've changed it to a relatively long title. It's not one of the longest we have, but it is a mouthful. So now we do have Mac and iOS forensic analysis and incident response. I think that kind of covers all the aspects that I am teaching now in this class. I see one question in here. Is it safe to say iPod Touch is covered under the iOS umbrella? Certainly the newer iPod Touches, absolutely. It's basically just an iPhone without the cellular capabilities. So you're gonna have many of the same artifacts on there. So absolutely, it is certainly in that iOS aspect. Now, moving on, it's been continuously updated. I like to joke that this is a second full-time job for me. I do have a full daytime job, but the Mac stuff and iOS stuff has changed so much, especially with mobile devices and new operating systems coming out literally every fall. It's hard to keep up and keep this continuously updated, but I have done actually, I think, a pretty good job with that. As soon as a new operating system comes out, I am going in there, I'm checking all the different artifacts, I'm removing some old ones, putting in some new ones. If I could have a month-long course, I might be able to fit everything in, just because there is that much stuff that's going on there. So if you think there's some old stuff that I'm covering, well, I got news for you, because I got rid of a lot of stuff to make more room for a lot of the newer stuff. So we're mostly covering everything from macOS 10.10 and iOS 8.0, with a few other little tidbits here and there. So up into the newest and the latest and greatest. As soon as I get access to put that stuff into my course, I've done the research, I'm putting that in there as soon as I can. Now, also worth mentioning, I have a book included. If you took the old version of the course, I used to give out the Mac internals book. Unfortunately, that book has not been updated. It's also somewhat difficult to get. So I've replaced it with what I think is a really good book, and it has a nice mix of the stuff that we're talking about in the course itself, and that is OS X Incident Response, Scripting and Analysis by Jaron Bradley. Also, some students like it because it's a thinner book than the one I used to give out, which makes traveling home with a lot of these books a little bit easier. If anybody's taken a SANS course before, you know how big the books are. So I try to find one that's a little bit more travel friendly for you. So I do like that book. I think it's a good one to include. Now, the new labs and data. This is where I think a lot of my most current work has been in updating. One of the hardest things to do, if anybody's made a course before, has made an image for testing and things like that, it's data population. It's creating a scenario that doesn't look fake. So what I do, and I don't know, maybe some of you guys don't know how much work actually goes into this, but if you have seen me within the last, I think I started creating this scenario back in November. I've been carrying around with all my travels 3 laptops, multiple phones, USB drives, all sorts of crazy stuff. And I'm going all over the world, all over the country. So I'm getting realistic locational data, access point information, communication stuff going back and forth, because I want the most realistic data I can possibly provide. And that, of course, is all stuff that I'm doing myself. So I'm, talking to myself on different computers. It makes me sound like I'm absolutely crazy. And by the end of it, you do feel like a nut. But hopefully that data is going to be worthwhile. So as far as data is concerned, we're looking at macOS 10.13. We're looking at iOS 11, multiple devices, multiple different systems. And these are not VMs. These are straight up bare metal laptops that I've been carrying around with me for many months. Again, I don't want to cheat with VMs. Therefore, I have all my old Macs coming into play to help provide that realistic data. Now, with that, there comes new class requirements. And I'm hoping some of my students for the Austin class are listening. And if not, this is a big new class requirement. I am now requiring 10.13 to be run as the base system for the course. Now, whether you're doing that on bare metal or if you do it in a VM on a Mac, it doesn't matter to me, but 10.13 is pretty much required. And that has to do with the new APFS course image mounting. So the binaries that are needed for that are only available on 10.13 and newer. If I could make it to where I could do 10.12, 10.11, I honestly wish I could. And I have tried everything in my capabilities that I've tried. Pushing the correct binaries to the older systems is just not going to work properly. So please come in with a 1013 system. It'll make things quite a bit smoother. Now, if you want an older system, and I definitely do not recommend this, but it's not completely undoable, you'll just be running everything through the commercial tools. So you are going to miss some of the aspects of the course by not mounting these things in the native environment. So just a heads up there. And I also just want to point out a few prereqs for the class. This course it's not a basic course. It is a relatively advanced course. And I do put a lot of command line stuff into it. Now, if you're not comfortable with the command line, I really recommend kind of working through a couple of these command line tutorials. These two I find are really good and very appropriate for what we're doing in class. And I'm not looking for some, advanced command line foo or anything like that, but, just the basics, basic Unix command line stuff in the Apple terminal. And that's going to be the perfect baseline for you. I'm there to answer questions. I'm more than happy to help you out explaining what each command does. Now, you won't really have to come up with any commands yourself. Literally everything is written out in the workbook. So I'm not going to make you try to remember what you have to do. It's going to be kind of like a walkthrough process. But it's good to get that command line, being comfortable with it right out in front, because that'll help you focus on a lot of the artifacts and the tools and things that we're going to play around with. Now we got a couple of cheat sheets. Now my forensics on the right-hand side here, the forensics 518 worksheet, or excuse me, reference sheet is not new, but it's been updated for a lot of the stuff that I've added to the course. So new mounting commands, Apple does change some of their command line options and things. So I have updated that. And I do believe the newest one is already available for download from the SANS cheat sheet repository. Now on the left-hand side, this is the SQLite Pocket Reference Guide. Heather and I created this and introduced it into our classes. Mine's the Mac one, hers is the mobile one, because we end up doing a lot of SQLite stuff. I know she does a lot of stuff, building queries and looking at databases and things like that, and as well as I do. I have a whole day that's basically all just apps, and that's what I call the database day, because you're just hitting database after database after database, trying to look at those raw databases, trying to look at the raw data. And if you want, I don't force anybody to create their own queries, but I do give you some examples to kind of copy and paste in there and kind of play around with them. This Pocket Reference Guide will help explain a lot about what's going on there. So SQLite, it's not a full-blown programming language, it's a query language, but it's extremely useful to know if you are doing a lot of Mac stuff, if you're doing a lot of mobile stuff. Now, mobile, it doesn't have to be iOS, it could be Android as well. There's a lot of SQLite databases on those platforms. So those are also included in the course, and we will certainly go through them the whole week. Now let's kind of do like a little gist of a day-to-day. So first day, I kind of start you off in a nice little easy morning, get things a little warmed up. We go through some Mac essentials. We do talk about Mac analysis in the Windows world. I know not everybody does their Mac analysis in a Mac environment. This class is kind of show you what all you're missing. Every once in a while, I might put in a Mac image into some forensic suite of choice, whether it be X-Ways or FTK or any of the other ones, just to see how those Windows-based suites handle a lot of the different artifacts. And what I find is that it's not handling them that well. So I end up coming back out of that Windows environment, doing my Mac analysis the way that I've done it, because it just makes it so much easier. You have no idea how much you're missing by being confined into your Windows forensic suite. A lot of these tools just do not know how to appropriately display things like extended attributes or resource forks, or it's just interpreting the file system incorrectly. We'll talk more about that in a little bit later on. Now, as far as Mac Essentials and acquisition go, we could certainly have a whole course on just acquisition. There's so many different aspects of it to think about, to go wrong, but we do have a few modules in there that we talk about, some of the specific caveats, what to look for, things like encryption, core storage, Block size could even be one of those things that it's just good to know when you're doing a Mac acquisition. So we'll talk a few about those. And then we get into the image mounting. So the way I do my analysis is I have a mounted macOS image mounted through the operating system. And I also bring it up within Blacklight. It's a forensics suite. They've done a great job with their Mac parsing of it. So I really do appreciate that. And I will bounce back and forth between the two. Some things I like doing within Blacklight, some things I like doing on the command line. You know, I'm trying to use the best method for what type of analysis I want to do. Then in the afternoon, we get into some of the iOS aspects. And again, a little bit more on acquisition. Again, could also have a full course in just acquisition, but we go in through some of the caveats. What to look for, the different types of encryption, backup passwords, how to crack encrypted backups, how to get iCloud data. What is jailbreaking? Should I do jailbreaking? There are certain folks who want to do that. There are certain folks certainly that can't do that, legally speaking. So we do have a good discussion with some of the security aspects as well. Then finally, at the end of the day, we're bringing out the hex editors. I'm going to talk about disks and partitions. You're going to see a lot of hex screenshots. I am not shy about showing hex. Then you start going to parse the GPT partition table, going old school. Do it bit by bit. A lot of the tools will do this for you. We will discuss those, but I want you to at least do it once to kind of get a feel for what you're seeing. There are some strange, weird aspects about it that you might not know without doing that parsing that one time. But then we also get into some of the different Mac aspects. Things like file vault. What does the encryption look like? What's something to keep in mind when you're doing an acquisition? Same thing as core storage. New to this one is we're talking a little bit more about APFS. That is Apple's new file system. So Apple hasn't really changed file systems in almost 2 decades. So they threw that in there with this last version. So we'll certainly be taking a closer look at that from a practical standpoint. We won't get fully in depth with it yet because Apple has not released their final spec for the file system. I do hope to add that in there at some point, but I'm sort of waiting on Apple to kind of release that. So it's changing too much right now to really put that module in there. So that is one thing I'm waiting on. But as far as from a practical standpoint, APFS is all over these images, all over the whole week. If you're looking to do APFS stuff, there is plenty of APFS stuff in there. We're just not doing it on the literal bit by bit level at this point. But that will be coming. I couldn't even tell you when at this point. I'm, again, mostly waiting on Apple. So if anybody's out there from Apple, maybe poke that bear a little bit. I'd appreciate it because I can't wait to put that in there. We'll also be talking about containers and fusion drives and disk images and all just the weird Mac disk stuff that's available. So some of it's older, some of it's newer, what to look for, the different caveats with that, how to image them without being able to, screwing it up later and finding out, too late where you no longer have the system in front of you. So as far as labs go, we got a nice lab setup right first thing, right as you walk in the door that first day. Then we get into the Blacklight image mounting lab, go into the different aspects of iOS acquisition. So I give you a few different aspects of iOS acquisition so you can see the difference between a physical dump versus an iOS backup dump, because not everything is in an iOS backup dump. As people pay $10,000 for their mobile tools expecting it to collect everything. Well, I got news for you. It does not. So there's a lot of stuff in those physical backups that you might not be able to legally do on your own standpoint, but I want you to know what's available there in case you ever if it ever comes down to having to do that yourself. So I'll go through the various aspects of that. And then finally, at the end of the day, we are going to parse some disks and partitions by hand. Now, day two. Day two starts off with the hard stuff. So I used to do this at the end of day one, but then I had a lot of people pretty much hating me for making them parse a whole file system on the end of day one after they've been exhausted all day. So we start off day two. I make you do the hard stuff first. So we're going to go really in depth with the HFS Plus file system, parsing it by hand, knowing how the data structures are storing different aspects, things like the permissions, the file sizes, the extents, the extended attributes, how it's being stored within the file system. So you can later on take a look at that if you need to and parse it out if your system, if your forensic suite of choice does not do the parsing. Now we'll also certainly talk about Apple file systems. So I go into some of the aspects like things like the file system clones, the file clones, the snapshots, different aspects of that new file system, as much research as I can put in there with it. But we do not have the in-depth stuff just yet, but that is incoming. That is just the one aspect I wish I could have put in here. But again, Apple did not allow me to do that, sadly. So next up, after I completely beat you down with a hex editor, again, no apologies for that, I'm going to talk about extended attributes, all the really cool stuff associated with the file system, but that's on top of the file system, how it is used with the file system. So things like extended attributes. These are little data pieces that get tagged with particular files. From a forensic standpoint, it is gold what you find in those extended attributes. Most forensic suites just don't show those to you. And I'm talking about the Windows forensic suites here. Blacklight actually does a pretty good job with that. Then we get into the file system event store database. Like I say here, it's like journaling, but way more awesome. It's like a persistent journal. And SQLite, macOS does a whole indexing thing where you can query it, and it's pretty fantastic with it. And then we get into some portable artifacts. So I don't really have a great name for this one, but it is the stuff that is left behind on external media when it touches a Mac. So a lot of the aspects from SQLite, FS Event Store, extended attributes, all play into that. So how does a FAT file system deal with it? How does exFAT deal with it? And then at the end part of the day, Mac and iOS triage. You know, you're looking for identifiers, phone numbers, account information, social media, all sorts of that triage information, install information, what network was this thing on, stuff like that. And then finally, at the end of the day, we get into the most recently used stuff. What applications was it using? What documents did it have open? What directories were last accessed? Things like that. So that pretty much covers that day. So as far as labs, we got an in-depth HFS file system lab, file system fun. And yes, it's called file system fun because I think it's fun. It's really, really interesting stuff. And it's all very Mac-like. You know, people who work other file systems don't get to touch stuff like this all the time. And then finally, a Mac and iOS triage at the end of the day. So I see another question here. It says, do you have to have strong Windows forensics background to follow this course? Absolutely not. Just a basic forensics background is appreciated. Just so you can, you know some of the terms and some of the other aspects of it. But I will be perfectly honest, I haven't touched a Windows box in 4 years. I used to be great at Windows forensics, but I haven't touched it. And people say, this is like a shell bag, or this is like a volume shadow copy. And I'm just like, nodding. Yep, I'm going to assume you're right because I have not touched it in so long. I truly don't even remember what most of those artifacts are. So I do mobile all day long and Mac all night long. So certainly having a forensics background is useful, but as far as Windows forensics, definitely not. This is very much a Mac-based course. So next up, day 3. So day 3, we're doing more of some of the system level stuff. So system configuration type of items. Start off with a bunch of, it's kind of like a plist-a-thon, if you will. But we get into some keychains and bash histories before we get into a lot of the plists. But all the plists, if you're coming from the Windows perspective, this is like a blown out version of the registry. It's keys, it's values, it's configuration type of data. So we'll get into some of those aspects in there. We'll talk about the application bundles because it's not just a single executable. There's a lot of stuff going around it. We'll talk about system updates, things like that. And then midday, we'll get into log parsing and analysis. So the one great thing about the Mac system is that there are logs everywhere. Like a true Unix system, there are just logs for just about anything you want. The tricky part is that there's different formats. So some of these, older style Unix ASCII-based logs, they are archived, they are turned over. We'll talk about the recovery of some of these. But then we get into some of the other slightly different ones that you might not have seen before. So BSM audit logs. If you want to know when somebody logged in, logged out, when they did some privilege escalation type of stuff. Then we get into Apple system logs. Newer versions of the operating system use this less, but older ones certainly use it quite a bit more. And then we get into the brand new ones. So unified logs came out in the last couple of versions, and these are quite a bit more complex. So knowing how to parse these, knowing what tools can parse them, also knowing what tools can't parse them, is going to be going to be a big benefit to you. Talk a little bit about configuration as well. So different logs stick around for different periods of time. And turnover and things like that, what to expect with all those different log files. Then finally, at the end of the day, we're going to start putting some stories together to a little bit more timeline analysis and correlation. So taking a plist, taking a log file, and getting a better aspect, a better story of what happened on that particular system. And we go through a lot of different topics. What networks did this thing touch? The system state, was the system booted up or not? How is the user accessing the system? Do they have privileged access? Should have they had privileged access? Accounts being created or deleted, software installations. We even get into backups and even some locational data right at the end there as well. So labs for this one, a bunch of plists in the morning with the user data and system configuration. Then we get into log parsing. So we're going to parse out a bunch of logs. We're going to keep those logs around because we're going to also use them in the next exercise, which is timeline analysis and data correlation. So one, we're parsing them and doing a basic analysis. In the last one, we're using all that data and getting quite a bit more analytical. And then we have day 4. This is my app day. So app day, we start off with some fundamentals, a little bit about where app data is actually being stored. Now it's going to be different on Mac, it's going to be different on iOS. I'll also talk about some of the permissions. I like talking about permissions. If you are looking for photos, go to some of these databases and things and look for applications that deal with photos who've asked permissions for the photos database. We get into certainly some of the traditional forensic locations like the browsers, the Apple Mails of the world, different communication. And communications, everything from your iMessage chat, SMS chat, to voicemails, to different FaceTime, things like that. Then get into some of the native applications on the system. So calendar reminders, 2 separate applications. They actually use the same database on the back end. It's kind of different than other ones. Contacts, notes. I always love talking about the notes application. You think it's going to be really simple. Oh, on the back end, it definitely is not a simple database to look at. So we'll go through some of those aspects. We'll get into some Apple Pay. You can try to put together what the user's been purchasing, where have they been traveling. I know I fly United all the time. If you looked at my passes directory, you can figure out exactly where I'm going pretty much all the time because I don't get rid of anything. Along the same places for locations, photos and maps, locational data. Locational data is kind of some interesting stuff. It's kind of one of those things that I am really into. I love being able to track people. Call me a little bit creepy, but it can be darn useful in an investigation to pull out some location-based data. And that's not just on iOS devices that have GPS. You can also do it on macOS devices. We'll also talk about Apple Watch things, as well as third-party apps at the end of the day. We don't get into any particular app specifically, but I'm more or less telling you, how do I do third-party application analysis? How do I get into these devices? What do I pull down? How do I research third-party apps? Because they change so frequently. If I do a teardown today, it's not going to be the same thing next week. So I'm doing a more fundamental overview on how these teardowns really work. The different tools that I use, things like that. So as far as labs go, first one, we got Safari and Mail. It actually does have some of the permissions and fundamental stuff in there as well. And then the last part of the day, I kind of split it up with applications part 1, then applications part 2. And it's more or less a choose your own adventure. I got something for everybody in there. So I have a lot of topics to cover, and there's just a little different pieces here and there, depending on what truly interests you. What do you need to learn when you go back to your labs and parse some of these databases out? Now, day 5. Day 5, we're getting into some of the more advanced stuff, or all the other stuff that I couldn't fit elsewhere. But we got a lot of stuff going on here. So first off in the morning, talking about 2 topics that look pretty similar and have similar usage. So Time Machine and document versions. So Time Machine is Apple's default backup utility. So we want to be able to see what's been backed up. How do we do the analysis of it? Anybody who's done a Time Machine analysis would probably prefer never to do one again, and I cannot blame them. But at least having the background knowledge of how to do one and what it looks like can prepare you for one that is potentially in your future. Then we move to document versions. This is basically Time Machine on a per document level. So it's got a lot of weird storage stuff. You see chunk storage in there. It is being stored on the file system itself, but it is an interesting feature to look at if you've never looked at it before. But having historical versions of documents can be extremely useful and from an investigative standpoint. Next up, we talk a little bit about iCloud. iCloud, what things are being synced, what is actually being stored on the various devices versus what's being stored within the iCloud Apple repositories up in the ether themselves. And then finally getting to some of the security aspects. So malware and intrusion analysis. Talk about some malware samples, some real life Mac and iOS malware samples. How to look for these things. Certain aspects associated with quarantine, Xprotect, Gatekeeper, so all the security layering stuff on there. What can we use, not even from an intrusion aspect, but how can we use those particular features from a traditional forensic analysis as well? And that leads us into live response. So if you are doing a collection of a system, what commands can you run? Can you run certain commands that'll pull out certain volatile information that'll help you? Network connections, processes, certain aspects about encryption, things like that will be covered. And then finally, we finish up the day with what I think are my 2 favorite modules. Leave those for last. And that is memory acquisition and analysis. If you've done memory analysis before from a Windows perspective, you might not have known that it's possible to do it on the Mac side. There's fewer tools out there that do it, but we will have a whole lab associated with bringing a memory dump up in volatility and taking a look at it from a more in-depth point of view. Then that also brings us to password cracking and encrypted containers. So cracking all the things. Again, in our lab, at the end of the day, we're going to crack user passwords. We're going to crack keychains. So we're not going to crack file vault. We just don't have time for that. But we are going to crack another DMG file. So it's going to show you kind of a proof of concept how to crack all these things. So we're going to crack a few things, but I'll be perfectly honest, we don't have hours and hours and hours to wait around, but you'll see that it is in fact possible. We just need a few more hours, a few more days to actually wait for the cracking to finish. But then you can take it back into your labs when you get back, and you can actually run at the full distance if you want. It will crack, I promise you on that one. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about creating dictionary files to help said cracking as well. So as far as the labs go, the first one, we got Time Machine and document versions. They interact well together. Then we get into the malware live response aspect of it. And then finally, at the end of the day, we'll do a memory analysis. We'll create a dictionary from a memory dump, which we'll use for password cracking and the encrypted containers that I have for you to crack. So pretty realistic scenarios. And then finally, on day 6, this is the brand new Mac Forensics Final Challenge. So we've had final challenges before. If you've taken another forensics SANS class before, it's very similar. So I have a whole new scenario, very realistic content, like I've said again. and it's all interrelated. So you're going to get into a team and you're going to work this scenario for day 6. There's brand new images. There's system images. There's memory dumps. There's iPhone images, both backups and physical. So there's a little bit of everything and a little bit of everything for everyone in there. So if you solve the challenge, and it is a competition, you will win the brand new class coin, which I'm super proud about. I think it's the prettiest coin of the whole forensics curriculum, though I am a bit biased. So this is our brand new class coin. We've only had it for a few classes thus far, so it's still pretty darn rare. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the Latin around the coin, but it does stand for, give or take, command more and think differently. Now, anybody who has a Mac in front of them, if you look down at your command button, you will see that clover leaf thing that you see on the coin. See where I'm getting at? Command more, think different. Yeah, very Mac related, right? As well as the colors of the coin. So it's a very simply designed coin, but the colors in the clover leaf, this is the old school Mac logo. So if you look up old Mac logo, is the rainbow striped apple with the bite taken out of it. It's just kind of a little shout out to the old school Mac stuff. So I like to say, you know, knowing how Apple has done what they've done for so long can actually help you in your investigations now. Because like, oh, you'd be like, oh, Apple does this weird thing and they've been doing it for years. Or Apple has recently changed this thing, but it's a shout out to an old thing that we've seen in the past. So it's a nice little kind of hat tip to old school Apple in that respect. But I do think it is the prettiest. And then we have Net Wars. So Net Wars, I've recently just finished. I'm kind of going over the the few last minute things with a brand new set of questions for Net Wars. So if you've played Net Wars before and you've played the Mac questions before, which were introduced about a year ago in Austin, those are the last time you're going to see them. We have a brand new set of questions on a brand new course image. So we're talking APFS, we're talking brand new file system stuff, we're talking pretty much everything covered in the course to answer these. So all 4 levels, plenty of questions with them. Now, if you haven't heard, we have a coin slayer competition at the DFIR Summit in Austin. This one is something, I don't think we've done this before. I know other curriculums have done this before, but if you complete all questions in all levels for a particular course, so if you complete properly, if you correctly complete all the Mac questions, you win that course's coin during the DFIR Summit in Austin. So this is an easy way to knock out a couple coins by just playing Net Wars in the evenings of day 3 and day 4. So I think this is kind of cool. I'm kind of waiting to see how it goes. So if you've played Net Wars before, this is a whole different level of Net Wars. If you've played Net Wars before and you didn't win the coin, or you've taken a course and you didn't win the coin in their challenge, this is also a great way to get access to that coin. So kind of one of those collect them all kind of deals. So Forensics 518 is going to be at the summit this year. I'm looking forward to it. All the new stuff is actually going to be released at the summit this year. So, 518 2.0, if you will, is going to happen in, it's like 2 weeks away at this point. So the summit is June 7th and 8th. This is a great little conference. It's one of my favorites of the year. I like it because it's a bit more advanced than some of the other forensic conferences that are out there. So it's what I like to call my forensic summer camp, if you will. And that's immediately followed by the classes. So June 9th through 14th, we got a lot of classes going on with the summit in Austin. Hope to see you there. Then Net Wars are the evenings right after class, June 12th and 13th. So this is the Coin Slayer, I believe, is only going to be at the DFIR Summit in Austin. So it's a kind of a new special competition just for our own little summit thing that we have going on. So if you want to play with the new revamped material and you want to be the first, we got the DFIR Summit in Austin. I don't know how many slots are available. I know it was getting pretty full last time I checked. But if you can't make it to Austin, it's fine. I'll see you in Vegas, always a good time. Prague, the beer is cheaper than water. Again, always a great time. And then brand new, never been there before, Sydney, Australia. So it's the first time this course has made it anywhere near there, to be perfectly honest with you. So I hope some of my Aussie friends will come out and see me and we can talk about Mac stuff while I'm down there. So that's all I have for now. If you do have questions, feel free to ping me on email or through Twitter. And if you want more information, I got my website down there, macforensics.com, as well as the course website. So forensics518.com will give you the links to that. So this is all I have. Does anybody have any questions for me? I'm hearing crickets. Sounds good to me. All right, I'm going to throw it back to you, Carol.
All right, well, thank you so much, Sarah, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in.
Oh,
First,
I got one question, sorry.
Sure, go ahead.
Is the updated content available on demand also? So I will be recorded in Austin, and as soon as SANS does whatever SANS magic they do for on demand, it'll be available on the on-demand version of the course as well. I don't know what the timeline of that is. I believe it's maybe a few weeks or so afterwards. So make sure you keep up with the SANS folks and ask if it is the updated material or not.
All right, well, for a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.